The autumn of 1946 was not kind to the Duke of Windsor. He was 52 years old, living in exile in Paris, watching from across the Channel as his former kingdom rebuilt itself without him. 10 years had passed since he had signed away his crown for Wallis Simpson, and every one of those years had been a lesson in diminishment. He had been a king. He had been an emperor. Now he was a tourist in his own life, reduced to attending parties and writing letters that went unanswered. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon actually was in 1946. Not the elderly queen mother waving from balconies. The woman at the peak of her power. The woman who had watched her shy, stammering husband forced onto the throne because his brother wanted to marry an American divorcee. The woman who had stood in the rubble of bombed-out Buckingham Palace during the Blitz, refusing to evacuate, telling reporters she was glad the palace had been hit because now she could look the East End in the face. This was not a passive figure. This was a woman who had fought for the monarchy's survival with every breath in her body. And she had never, not for a single moment, forgiven Edward for what he had done to her family. The animosity ran deep. Elizabeth had described Wallis Simpson as the lowest of the low long before the abdication. She blamed Wallis for everything, for the constitutional crisis, for the strain on George, for the burden that was slowly killing her husband year by year. George VI was already showing signs of the arterial problems that would require surgery in 1948. He was exhausted. He was deteriorating. He was grinding himself down under a weight he had never asked to carry. And every time Elizabeth looked at her husband's declining health, she saw Edward's face. She saw the brother who had walked away. She saw the woman who had made him do it. But here's what the history books don't emphasize. Elizabeth's hatred wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. She understood something that Edward never grasped. The monarchy's survival depended on moral authority, on the perception that the royal family represented standards that ordinary people aspired to. The moment you allowed a twice-divorced American back into court, you validated everything Edward had done. You suggested that the abdication had been a noble sacrifice for love, rather than a dereliction of duty. You undermined the entire narrative that had kept the monarchy legitimate through the war years. George and Elizabeth had earned the people's loyalty by suffering alongside them. Edward and Wallis had spent the war in the Bahamas, playing golf. The contrast could not be permitted to blur. The war had made things worse for Edward, not better. While George VI and Queen Elizabeth had stood in the rubble of bombed-out London, sharing the suffering of the people, Edward had spent the conflict as governor of the Bahamas, a position so transparently designed to keep him far from Europe that even he understood the insult. Churchill had packed him off to Nassau in 1940, ostensibly as an honor, actually as a quarantine. The Duke's pre-war sympathies toward Nazi Germany had not been forgotten. His visit to Hitler in 1937 still hung over him like a verdict. But in October 1946, Edward saw his opportunity. The Labour government under Clement Attlee had swept to power in the 1945 election, and the old guard who had engineered his abdication were no longer in control. Churchill was in opposition. Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister who had forced his hand in 1936, was dead. A new generation of politicians who hadn't witnessed the abdication crisis firsthand now occupied Downing Street. Perhaps, Edward calculated, they might be open to a different arrangement. Perhaps they might see the utility of having a former king back public life, not on the throne, of course, but as a roving ambassador, a ceremonial figure, a symbol of reconciliation. The Duke began laying groundwork. He wrote to his brother George VI, seeking a restoration of his civil list allowance and proposing that he be given some official role. He hinted that he might be useful in the new post-war order, a bridge to America perhaps, or a goodwill ambassador for the Commonwealth. He suggested that he and Wallis might be permitted to live in England again, at least part of the year. The letters were polite, fraternal, carefully calibrated to suggest that bygones should be bygones. George VI read these letters with exhaustion. He understood his brother's position. He even felt guilty about it. But he also understood that Edward's return would create constitutional chaos. A former monarch living in Britain, attending events, giving speeches, it would create an alternative center of gravity, a shadow court that could destabilize everything. And then there was Elizabeth. His wife had never forgiven Edward for forcing him onto the throne. Any softening toward Edward would have to go through her, and Elizabeth was not disposed to soften. Then came the moment that brought everything to crisis. Not a letter or a meeting, but a burglary. On October 16, 1946, while the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were staying at Ednam Lodge in Berkshire, the country home of their friend the Earl of Dudley, someone broke in and stole Wallis's jewels. The haul was enormous, an estimated £25,000 worth of gems, including pieces that Edward had given her during their courtship and items that had once belonged to the royal collection. The police were called. Scotland Yard opened an investigation, and very quickly, the case became something more than a robbery. The problem was the jewels themselves. Some of them had histories that the Duke did not want examined. Several pieces had been quietly removed from the royal collection before the abdication. Family heirlooms that Edward had taken as personal property, but which the palace considered stolen. Other pieces had been gifts from questionable sources, including jewels that had allegedly passed through Nazi hands during the Duke's flirtation with Hitler's regime. The theft at Ednam Lodge threatened to expose all of this, to drag the Duke's wartime conduct back into the newspapers just as he was trying to rehabilitate himself. The Duke panicked. He pressed Scotland Yard to keep the investigation quiet, to recover the jewels without public attention. But the story leaked anyway, and suddenly, Fleet Street was asking uncomfortable questions. Where had these jewels come from? Why was a former king staying with the Earl of Dudley? What exactly was Edward Windsor doing in England, and what did he hope to achieve? The robbery had blown his cover. His quiet campaign to ease back into British life was now being conducted under the full glare of media scrutiny. More damaging still was the suspicion, never proven but persistently whispered, that the robbery had been an inside job. Some in Scotland Yard suspected that the theft had been staged to collect insurance money, or to destroy evidence of the jewels' origins, or simply to generate publicity for a duke who craved attention. The Earl of Dudley's household staff were interviewed. Servants talked. Rumors spread. By November 1946, the Duke of Windsor was no longer just an exile seeking rehabilitation. He was a figure of scandal, surrounded by questions about theft, Nazi gold, and insurance fraud. The Ednam Lodge affair forced the palace to take a position. George VI could not ignore what was happening. His brother was in England, at the center of a criminal investigation, generating precisely the kind of negative attention that the monarchy could least afford in the fragile post-war moment. The king summoned Walter Monckton, the lawyer who had served as Edward's confidant since before the abdication, and asked for a frank assessment of the situation. Monckton was in an impossible position. He had been loyal to Edward for years, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the mood of the palace. He told the king the truth. The Duke was not going to give up. Edward was convinced that time had healed the wound, that the British people would welcome him back, that he deserved a role in public life. Monckton warned that if the palace continued to freeze Edward out completely, the Duke might go public with his grievances, might write memoirs, might give interviews, might create exactly the kind of spectacle that the monarchy was trying to avoid. The king consulted his wife. Elizabeth's response was immediate and unambiguous. Edward could not be allowed back. Not now, not ever. The jewel theft had exposed what she had always known, that Edward was unreliable, scandal-prone, incapable of discretion. His wartime conduct had already raised questions about his judgment. His relationship with Wallis, the twice-divorced American for whom he had thrown away the crown, remained an affront to the moral standards that the monarchy was supposed to uphold. If he were permitted back into public life, Elizabeth argued, it would validate his choice. It would suggest that the abdication had been a noble sacrifice rather than a dereliction of duty. She would not permit it. The king agreed, but he was gentler about it than his wife. He wrote to Edward in late 1946, expressing fraternal affection while making clear that a return to public life was not possible. The letter was careful to blame constitutional constraints rather than personal hostility. George VI explained that as a former monarch, the Duke could never live in Britain without creating impossible complications. The Duke would receive his allowance. He would remain a member of the family, but he would remain in exile. The Duke received this letter as a betrayal. He had convinced himself that George was on his side, that the only obstacles were courtiers and advisers who could be outmaneuvered. To learn that his own brother was closing the door was devastating. He wrote back immediately, protesting, arguing, demanding. He pointed out that he had served loyally during the war. He noted that he had given up everything for Wallis and deserved something in return. He invoked their childhood, their shared memories, the bond of blood that should transcend politics. George did not reply. The decisive confrontation came in early 1947 when the Duke made one final attempt to force the issue. He traveled to England again, ostensibly for personal business, actually to lobby anyone who would listen. He met with old allies from his brief reign. He dined with sympathetic politicians. He made it known that he was available, willing, eager to serve, and he requested a formal audience with his brother, the king. George VI granted the audience, against Elizabeth's advice. The two brothers met at Buckingham Palace in February 1947, their first extended private conversation since the abdication. What passed between them has never been fully revealed. Neither left a detailed account, but the outcome was unambiguous. Edward left the meeting, knowing that his cause was lost. George had made clear that he would not, reverse the decisions of 1936. The title of Royal Highness would not be extended to Wallis. The civil list would not be increased. There would be no official role, no return to British life, no rehabilitation. The rejection was final, but it was also kind. George VI was not a cruel man, and he understood what he was doing to his brother. He offered what he could: continued private communication, occasional visits, the fiction of family unity. But the substance was gone. Edward was 53 years old, and he had just learned that the exile would never end. He and Wallis settled into their grand house in the Bois de Boulogne, entertaining celebrities, attending parties, growing old in elegant irrelevance. Edward worked on his memoirs, settling scores with everyone who had wronged him. He gave interviews that grew increasingly bitter. He never stopped believing he had been treated unfairly, and he never stopped blaming everyone except himself. And here is the final irony, the thing that makes this story more than just a tale of royal cruelty. Everything the Duke of Windsor died wanting eventually came to pass, just not for him. Divorce became acceptable for the royal family. Charles, the Queen Mother's own grandson, married Camilla Parker Bowles, herself divorced, and she eventually became queen. The rigid morality that had made Wallis Simpson unacceptable in 1936 had dissolved by 2005. The institution Edward had betrayed survived by abandoning the standards that had required his exile. He had been a generation too early. He had given up the throne for a principle that the monarchy would discard within a lifetime, but Edward never got to see that world. He died still exiled, still denied the title for his wife, still sending letters that went unanswered. The man who wanted to be king again never was. The Ednam Lodge robbery exposed his vulnerabilities at precisely the wrong moment. Elizabeth's implacable opposition sealed his fate, and the brother he had abandoned carried the burden until it killed him. One scandal, one refusal, decades of exile, and a queen who never forgave.